Thank you so very much for inviting me today to your, and of course in the labor laws, where women were no longer allowed to run for public office. Stoning was certainly because of Sharia that had became part of the civil code. Stoning started, compulsory veiling, exclusion from.
Also to point out that most of your reporters are women, so you have like a majority of female staff, which has been under notice of your government.
Well, yes, definitely. That was also not only because of the government that it turned out to be so, but also because it turned out that when we wanted to bring about a change in and join the internet age, it were the women who stayed behind and decided that we're going to take it because we could no longer distribute, the paper. The distribution costs were way more than we could afford. So by digitization and by it joining the internet, we increased this voice, and the voice that we have always, the values we've stood for, have been for separation of mosque from state, equal rights for women, and more women. And because inside Iran, women journalists have been at the forefront of change. And of course, there have been more and more of them having to leave the country and become refugees. Whereas I was the first generation of refugees. We're now down to the fifth, sixth generation of refugees in over 40 decades. So we've got, stars such as Masih Ali-Nejad, but also we've got other journalists, specifically the ones who work for us, who continue to write and report based on the social issues, economic issues, and stories where others would not want to cover. And that has been the strength of the paper at the moment. We are, our journalists are in Cyprus, in Turkey, all out of Iran, in the United States, in France, and it is thanks to internet that we've come together. And of course, the threat against the violence that we faced on the streets now have also been translated to more, at home because of the internet, because of where we're working from.
Internet, the friend and the foe.
Yes.
As far as press freedom and misinformation, as we're seeing now, it is also a tool of accessibility in places where press freedom, there's a blackout challenge that a lot of countries are going through in terms of press freedom. And then at the same time, there's a lot of violations also taking place on the internet and because of the internet. Just briefly, I know Asma Shirazi is not here, but since we're talking about the friend and the foe aspect of the internet and social media, I think I'll just briefly describe a little bit about the situation in some countries as we're seeing internet is used as a tool to challenge press freedom, to spread disinformation. I think this became very popular, surprisingly, in the Western Hemisphere too, as Donald Trump got elected and came into power in the last recent years. We've seen misinformation becoming a tool in the US and also encouraging other countries to be more bold about their misinformation campaigns online. But in the last 1.5 years in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, a lot of South Asian countries, especially, of course, China, we are familiar with that, where internet has been used to malign journalists, especially we've seen an increased campaign, 67% more online attacks take place against women reporters in this region. Asma today was going to join us, Asma Shirazi from Pakistan. She's one of the 20 members in Pakistan who has faced vicious online campaigns based on her reporting in the country. And sometimes these, because internet, it has this viral effect, it spreads like wildfire. A lot of that anger that takes place online in these online troll campaigns against journalists becomes physical, and we have seen physical attacks. There were 3 physical attacks that took place against women journalists in Pakistan this year alone, which led to a campaign, online campaign as well, and that women journalists were able to form a coalition and address the government to tackle these attacks online. So I guess I just wanted to point out that this internet is one of the things that we've seen as a resource, but it is also something that has debilitated press freedom and increased misinformation, increasing challenges against journalists and women especially. One more aspect of that is that I think that especially in countries where there is more misogyny and the gender disparity between the two genders is more prominent. Culturally, we see that women journalists are attacked more than male journalists, because we see that, I think that it creates more momentum when women are attacked. And if there's a misinformation campaign against a woman journalist, if you call her names, then we see that there is more. It becomes more popular. And that is something that we are seeing is used as a tool. In the US as well, we've seen Donald Trump do that in the last year. I wonder if I can move from here to Kirstin. Thank you for joining us. And I think that just briefly, I would give a bit of a landscape of when we started seeing women journalists being targeted more prominently in the US has been, I think it's been in the last 1.5 years, we've consistently seen from the US State Department, the press corps, lots of agitation there and friction there, where sometimes access is limited for journalists. But this year, with the spread of COVID-19, we started mapping women reporters who were covering the front line in the US beginning of March 2020. And soon after, I think early April, we started documenting different kind of violations that we were seeing that women journalists were facing while covering COVID-19 on a very difficult and a very new front line. And then with the Black Lives Matter protests, that we have seen all kinds of other violations that are taking place from protesters, as well as just being there and covering those violations, which the US Press Freedom Tracker has covered vigilantly. So if you could give us a little bit of an overview of the work that US Press Freedom Tracker has been doing, and what are your observations about press freedom in the US this year?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's really amazing to hear the other stories and place the US in some sort of context. So as you said, I'm Kirstin McCudden, and I'm the managing editor of the US Press Freedom Tracker. And that is a site that documents press freedom violations in the US. And we can put it in a little bit of context, because that context is going to be important when we talk about what we've seen this year. The tracker was launched in 2017 from a coalition of that includes Committee to Protect Journalists, Freedom of the Press Foundation, where we sit, and a handful of other press freedom advocacy groups and news orgs, because they realized there was not a singular repository for these type of aggressions in the US. And so when we talk about what's happening this year in 2020, and you touched on it, starting in March with the pandemic, and then really picking up speed at the end of May, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the end of May 25th. On May 26th, we saw our first journalist assaulted while covering national protests. And to give you some, from the end of May through right now, here we are in December, the US Press Freedom Tracker, let's say more than 960, nearly 1,000 press freedom violations have been reported to us. And so then what we do is we work to independently verify each and every one of those and put them into categories that we have. We track across almost a dozen categories. That's everything from assaults of journalists, and that can include getting hit with a projectile. It can include being beaten. It can include from either law enforcement or a protester, assaults, arrests, denial of access, though, also subpoenas of journalism. We touched a little bit about the chilling effects of all the different tools used to chill journalists and journalism. So we track across those categories really to give a sense of what's going on. And while it doesn't document before 2017, what the tracker can do is, I tell you, last year, 2019, we documented across those nearly a dozen categories, 150 different press freedom violations, adding it all up. Again, we're at nearly 1,000 for this year. So you can just imagine what type of year it's been, what type of year journalists have seen on the ground, international and down to the local level, have seen here in the United States. And we know protests have always been dangerous places for journalists. And we are tracking across nearly 80 cities in the US. So it's not just one place, although there are certain hotspots. It is 80 cities, 35 states across the US where we are seeing this year.
What are the hotspots? Could you talk a little bit about the hotspots?
Sure. We saw at the May and June, a lot of journalists assaulted and arrested in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That was definitely where the protests began. And from there, they sprang out. Portland, Oregon has now surpassed Minneapolis for a number of assaults and arrests of journalists because that city has had almost nonstop protests from the end of May forward, almost every single night. It has slowed. Those are a few hotspots. The election was another one for us. So that was just in November. We're still honestly working our way through those. I should tell you, the US Press Freedom Tracker, we sit at Freedom of the Press Foundation, but we're a team of 2 full-time journalists. But we have contributors working to help, contributing editors, contributing reporters, help us work through this backlog because more than 60 violations came from the election itself. That's election-related protests across the US. So yeah, those are a few hotspots. So both time and place we saw.
I do want to point out that this year, we in the Coalition for Women in Journalism, we documented globally 684 attacks, which makes up to 2.07 attacks per day, which includes weekends. These are all kinds of attacks, which includes raids and imprisonments, lawsuits against journalists, violations, physical attacks, attempts of acid attacks, etc., and imprisoned violations as well, deportations as well as murders. We had 2 murders this year. But I do want to say that United States suddenly in the last, I think since the COVID, United States became one of the top countries where we were constantly documenting, especially during the Black Lives Matter. We were consistently busy, even on weekends, tracking down all the violations that were taking place. Of course, we do document attacks against women journalists, but we do look at the landscape at large. That is something that is astonishing because in a lot of countries, and I will come to our next panelist, Shaimaa, from this point, is that I think that with the US violations increasing, we see that certain other countries, especially in the Middle East, have been emboldened to carry out press freedom violations against journalists and activists in general, because the US is so busy and we've had so many difficulties in the United States with Donald Trump not taking press freedom seriously, in fact, attacking the press itself. I think that emboldened certain regions. We saw that in South Asia, but also in the Middle East, where we see crazy violations in Egypt and other countries like Lebanon when things got rough with the protests, etc. So I think that I would come to you, Shaimaa. Thank you for joining. If you could, sort of give, and we can pick up from this point of if you have noticed an increase of violations in Egypt and the Middle Eastern region. If you could talk a little bit about that, and what are your observations in general?
Yeah, thank you so much, actually, for having me and inviting me for this webinar with among those incredible women who are doing a lot of work to highlight the challenges that's faced for female journalists are facing while they are trying to report their news. If I will start just back from what you just mentioned about reflection from the U.S. Policies on the region, of course, it served a lot the Middle East government and regimes in this area. Start since we have Trump in administration. He encouraged actually a lot of people who are like non-free countries and regimes who doesn't care about freedom. He called actually the Egyptian prison as his favorite dictatorship. So I believe this all had a big reflection to the human rights situation in Egypt and the freedom of expression and freedom of media in general. If we see the the current regime in Egypt, actually, we can't say it just started from 2014 by the election of electing El-Sisi, but also this regime actually started 2013 by the coup that happened in 2013, where the first steps and was not just the elected president, but also the first action was done by the military in this day was to arrest thousands of journalists and shut down news media and news channel and news outlet, online outlets. So this gives us, at the beginning in 2013, how we can, or where we are now in 2020 actually. So, and how this current regime in Egypt sees the media as the main enemy for the stability of this regime. We see that it developed to be kind of the current regime in Egypt was actually developed some laws to control the media and to put it all in the hand of the intelligence security. So all the public media and even so the private media in Egypt is owned by a company that publicly announced that it is affiliated to the intelligence security. And of course, with all of the work have been done with press freedom advocates and the human rights group to call for more space and more freedom environment for the media in Egypt, we couldn't find any sounds back from the US. He was always supporting what's happening in Egypt and still calling Egypt as a great partner. Also, even for the EU, also they call them a partnership relationship. So we couldn't see that there is any of the international development effect positively, but it affects negatively on the journalists in Egypt very widely. So now we have a lot of journalists in Egypt imprisoned, among of them a couple of famous journalists.
I just want to point out something that you're mentioning is very important, is that Egypt is one of the countries, of the many countries, where when press freedom challenges take place, also in Iran, Saudi Arabia, other countries, Pakistan, Turkey, where press freedom violations used to take place, and journalists and activists used to look out in the international community for support. Yeah. And to be able to do the advocacy work. And that really did help, that pressure that came from international support, especially from the United States. So there was a complete shift of that, where suddenly, kind of, if you may, all hell broke loose when Donald Trump started making statements such as media is the enemy, etc., which kind of like officially allowed these countries. And I think that we saw some official steps that were taken under the CC administration as well, after Donald Trump's statements. Yeah. So I just wanted to point out how important that was in making that shift.
It's like the green light have been given from the American, because everyone looked to this is the freedom, the dream of freedom. So everyone looking to have a media like what is happening in America. But when we hear now the recent development in the United States and the violence happened in the past years, so you can see that there is determination of the attitude or in the policies over it that is reflect in a double or triple in the region, where actually the country are not identified as a free country. it is dictatorship countries, and some of them actually, if you saw the index of the country freedoms that published by Freedom House, for example, from US, you will see the majority of the Arabic country is in non-freedom country, and is of course Egypt one of them. Of course Egypt, because it has a close connection with the United States. So they got kind of a green light to start to build the and control the media, and make a lot of harassment to journalists and female journalists who has been mainly targeted. And also I refer to what you said before. You talk about the culture and the effect of the culture of the female journalist itself. There's a part of the violence that female journalist is facing during their work is related to the culture itself, and how they see the women in the front line, that with you working, they can't believe that there is a woman who can perform this kind of work as a journalist, and they still look to the women that. And even in some of the state media, they are trying to promote the idea of the housewife or the female in the house. When you talk about the media, even if we watch the Arab media now, how many female, you can't count a famous female women working in a TV, state TV, in a newspaper, famous ones. If we talk about Egypt now, on those channels, on all the media, because it's controlled by the state security and it reflects the regime idea and view about the women, you can't see any female women who can criticize or can even criticize the society or have some point about the equality and the women's rights. There is no those kinds of the voices even. So even reporting about social problems, even reporting about women problems, now it's very much restricted, because the regime itself doesn't want this to appear in the media. They want only to have their own vision. And the second thing could be also, or we witness also to be one of the dangers that female women actually is that the citizen themselves. We saw, and in a couple of cases, we found that a group of citizens or people who voluntarily report against a female journalist or arrest her, or they hold her in a street while she's covering demonstration or covering even social activities, to hold her and to call the police to stop her. And they don't do the same with a male. They are afraid from the male, but they feel they are empowered over the women, because this is actually a culture issue that they cannot see until now, that female women can go to cover demonstration, can cover a strike in a company or something like this. And also, if we see recently what happening with a female journalist in Egypt, for example, we have our colleague Isra Abdel Fattah, who was tortured for more than 8 hours. Then she went and disappeared, and then she's now serving more than a year in prison without any charges and without any court or being in front of a judge or something. Also, we saw a couple of other journalists like Sulafa Magdi, who just was kidnapped from the street. Isra as well, she was just kidnapped from the street for doing what? For doing nothing, just reporting and writing for what we can say a legal newspaper. Because in Egypt now we have all the newspaper is controlled by the regime. As I said, now the new movement that journalists start to do is to establish this. And when it started, they found that most of the people going to read and to follow up this news gate, because it's more credible for the people who want to listen or to hear a different information, different ideas. The government created a law, make it very hard for any independent group of journalists to be able to register their news gate. And even for those news outlet or online outlet who was able to apply for the registration, they gathered the money and collected from each other, and they was able to apply for this registration. We found recently one of our colleagues, Noura Younis, who was arrested because she have an online news gate, independent one, and because they don't want to say we stop this news outlet because it's a media, they try to fabricate charges. to find any other charges. Like for El Manassa, for example, there was a charge that they are operating a different, they don't have alliances for the operation systems they have, but actually they are using our open source system, which is the prosecutor didn't understand it. What do you mean by open source? They are very limited to the Microsoft technologies. You don't understand that because independent journalists, they are looking to everywhere what kind of sources and informations and tools that can serve them and can help them. They are trying to find it, but now she was lucky actually because the interrogator, they couldn't understand what is it, and after 24 hours or 48 hours, she was released pending trial as well. And we see when they release any journalists from detention, they keep them pending trials. So it's up to the prosecutor to call them at any moment to open the case, and they can immediately prison them for non-stop time. So now in Egypt, we have, they could be on pre-trial detention for more than 2 years, even they cross the limits by the years. And we found a lot of people, journalists and non-journalists, who serve it this amount. We have one of the male journalists, who's Mahmoud Hussein, who's serving actually 3 years pre-trial detention. So he never met a judge, but and there is no clear charges against him, but they keep them in prison. And this also is reflected to other countries. If we saw the same situation in Saudi Arabia, also a couple of journalists or bloggers was detained just because they are writing about the right for women to drive, for example. And this is a social topic. It's not a political issue. They are not talking about politics, about election, about constitution, this kind of words that scares the people in the Middle East, but they are talking about the equality between men and women and the ability for women to have the right to drive. Other than if we went to see, like in Libya, for example, the conflict in Libya was very much affected the work of the journalists in general in Libya. Coming to the female with the culture problems that we can see, and what I can say. So because it is kind of a families and the group, so they see how come women can be a part and be in the front, and there is war or there is a conflict between military groups, and there is women there are able to report. And there was a woman journalist who used to report for Reuters as well in 2015, if I remember well. She was asked actually to leave the country immediately because she got a death threat from a military group, and she had to escape the country to save her life. And in other countries, so the point here, they compelled. And the problem here, the women in this region, and because of the culture, sometimes they are not able actually to report the violence they are receiving or the sexual harassment they face, because in the same time, as much as they are keen to do their work, they are also keen to not lose it. Actually, they don't want to lose the opportunity to be asked to go another time to cover demonstration, another time to cover front lines. If she said, for example, that she faced this kind of threats, so like sexual harassment or violence, their bosses, the male bosses, would say no. So it is safe for you to stay in the office, not to go outside. So we saw and documented cases of women who are very much afraid to report this kind of threats. However, it's very important that we document these threats and to know how to deal with it. Even the women, they should be trained on how they can protect themselves and how they can defend themselves in such a situation. And also, it's very important for them to know it is their right to be there. If they are qualified enough as a journalist to be in the front line or to cover a war zone, it is their right to be there. They are equal like a man, but they should not be feeling being shamed or being excluded from the team just because the male think this is the only way to protect you because you are female. So this is Yeah.
Thank you, Shaimaa. I think that there are some very important points that you discussed. One thing that I wanted to highlight is something that we have noticed as well in our documentation, that when women journalists are actually often in Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, Iran, women journalists are often the ones who are documenting violations against women and gender in the country, and minorities. Like in the case of Turkey, Kurdish journalists are the most number of women reporters who are in prison generally, amongst all male and female. So we are seeing that because women are kind of also coming on the front line and documenting a lot of the violations that are taking place, anti-democratic incidents that are taking place in these countries, we are seeing that women are targeted also because of that. And then there's this other aspect of misogyny as well, and the gender barrier, where we see, like in countries like Pakistan, where one of the ministers actually told me that who often goes on trolling women journalists online himself, he jokingly said that well, we get more momentum when we attack women journalists. So if we want to silence the press, we are more likely to go and look at a woman journalist and attack her than a male journalist, because it's more profitable, according to him. So I do think that while he said this kind of on the record jokingly, because the situation is that bad in Pakistan, I think that this kind of trend is happening in a lot of countries, where there's two things. One, that women are on the front covering the stories that are rather neglected, because there are more women covering, in journalism, and also that there is this misogyny aspect. And even if women are covering democracy and political issues in the country, and opposition in the country, they're targeted by dictators and difficult governments. So we are running out of time, and I wanted to go. I had some questions with all of you, so I'll just quickly go about. I did want to ask Nasta about some of the challenges that you faced in prison. You have been in very difficult circumstances, where you have been in prison twice, where you are moved from one prison to another prison, because the prisons are filling up and they're bringing in more protesters. And you have seen really difficult situations, including noise pollution, being in isolation, where you did not resource to be in a place where you did not have access to food, and other kinds of things, where I think you also mentioned once, when it was very cold, and out of resilience, you and your fellow prisoners who were protesters were singing, and you were then punished by being thrown outside in the cold at 5 degrees without having warm clothes. And so these kind of violations also caused a lot of mental health challenge and difficulties for you. Can you discuss that a little bit, about what kind of pressure this has been for you, and how you have sort of tackled that?
Yeah, it was tough, and even as I mentioned, my case is counted like very soft one in comparison with many other cases, but still it was really tough, because first time I've been in jail in September, second time in November, and I have to say that unfortunately during 2 months conditions became way worse, and workers there told that they have like spoken order to make life of prisoners there like unholdable, like really horrible. And I have to say that unfortunately they are very successful in that, because for example in one of the jails they never switch off the day lighting. They must switch it to night lighting that's not so bright, but they don't do that. So 24 hours we had to be in very bright light, and 16 hours a day we had radio quite loud. So in the end we actually just tried to cover it with sanitary pads, because you don't have a lot of resource there, and you have to use just what you have there, just to try to save your mental health as much as it's possible. Because sometimes they don't bring food. It happened to me a few times. Sometimes cells become really overcrowded. One night I spent in the cell where it was like there were beds for 6 people, but we were 11 of us there. And in other jail, I was like 10 people in the room for 8 people. And it was quite good because other women were 16 women in the room for 8 people. And it's really tough. You don't have enough space. You don't have enough air. Windows are closed during winter, and you're not allowed to open them. You physically cannot do that because that's the jail. It's not ordinary window. And in this coronavirus time, they often gave us, for example, 1 cup of tea for 2 people. So you even have to share like cups with someone else. That's actually not safe because in my last cell, there were at least 3 people with COVID. We saw it with the symptoms. And I don't know, maybe they were more, but we just didn't know that time.
I know that you were describing it previously when we were talking about how people were coughing and there was no resources and no effort to limit people have access to each other, even while, you know, it seemed like they had contracted the virus.
Yes, yes. One woman, when she lost her feeling of smells, she asked the workers today at least leave her the same, she has plates that only she gonna use, because they just bring plates, remove them, and they often don't really wash them. Like we had to wash them by ourselves, but we don't have enough resource to really wash it very well. And she told, please don't take away my cup, my plate, my everything. So other people don't use that. I'm sick, but no one cares. Really, no one cares about that. And of course, it affects mental health a lot. And I saw many women who really tried to be like very strong there, not to cry, just smile and everything. But even they, when they got released, later they told that later on they felt worse. Later on they passed through some like psychological tests and they see the result is bad, that they have signs of clinical depression because they passed through difficult things, through very tough things. And even if they try to act like it's okay, other people pass through way worse things, but I'm okay, it doesn't really help when we try to cover reality with some optimism. Not always is a good way to cope with things. So in my case, everything was like maybe more difficult than with others about mental health because I'm taking antidepressants and I didn't have enough medicine with me there. I had just half of the portion I needed. So I was trying to, I made my own new system how to take them, not to break it in the middle of the time. And when I came back home, yes, I had these post effects. Like a few days, I was just staying in bed and crying and couldn't do anything because it's chemistry of brain. If it doesn't work well at some point, you can be as strong morally as you can, but you just cannot be strong at some point.
Yeah, yes, you know, stress and PTSD and trauma from that kind of environment is there are chemical changes that take place in your body and your brain.
Yes, we're talking about PTSD with my colleagues a lot, and just literally a few days ago I had a case with my friend who's also working in this sphere. We were outside the house and we just saw few young guys, few students running, and we felt scared because if few young people are running, that probably means that someone is following them. And we immediately, our body language changed. We were like, oh, what's going on? You know, like ready to run. But they were just 3 students running. And we all had to cope with that somehow. And protesters and journalists as well, because we as journalists, we cannot turn off the news. Because if you ask psychologists how to pass through these difficult times, they say read less news, don't read news before going to bed. But if you're a journalist who's covering protests, you cannot do it like that. So we face a lot of challenges for our mental health as well and physical health, but somehow we have to do that.
I know that you along with other reporters have been consistently covering the issue despite of going back and forth from prison, and you keep on doing your job alongside all the threats that you're facing. It is also there are some similar situations in prison for Kurdish journalists in Turkey that we get recently. We just last week we documented an attack. Today there was another hearing of a journalist where journalists are sent to prison and then they're treated really badly. A similar situation in Kurdish prisons in the southeast of Turkey as well. But we see that consistently journalists do they keep on doing their job. I think one thing that really helps is to have a strong community. To have a support system, and where if you have the support system, it is easier to be able to do your job. And if you don't have, in the absence of support system, the challenge becomes greater if you're on your own. And I think that becomes very difficult for journalists to go back and work in the field.
Yeah, I'm sure that really support means a lot, and when we see that people support us, of course, it gives extra will and extra strength to come back to the job. Because, of course, we are also human beings, and of course, we're afraid because it's scary. You never know if you get into their hands, you never know what's going to happen. Maybe everything's going to be fine and quiet, or maybe they will rape you or beat you heavily, you never know. So to come back to work, you need to feel that it really means something, and that people appreciate this work, and that this work is really affecting something. And right now, yes, likely we can see that. So I cannot say about all the journalists, but about myself and other people who I know, that's what helps us to come back to work and not to get too scared, is that we know that we're doing something that's gonna change the situation to better. And there are many people who have to escape the country, and journalists as well, because they get under criminal investigations just because of doing their job. And right now, 3 journalists are under criminal investigation in the jail, and they are female journalists. Their names are Katerina Andreeva, Daria Chutsova, and Katerina Borisevich. They are in jail only because they were speaking out loud about things the government wanted to hide. So that's one other point that helps us to come back to work. We know that we have to do our job so these women and other political prisoners can get released as fast as possible, because they should not go through that. They just should not waste time, their health, their energy, because of this situation. They should be on freedom to do their job.
Thank you, Nasta. Nazenin, if I could, I wanted to say that something, a lot of the context from Nasta's conversation is also true for women journalists in Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. These are the top 3 countries where women are in prison. In Saudi Arabia, we kind of are facing a blackout of information, so we are not able to have access to what is happening in prisons. But from Iran and Turkey, we do know that there are violations that take place. Women journalists are treated really badly. That has something to do with how women are generally, the status of women and gender in these countries. If I could ask you a little bit about what do you think can be done about this? Is there something that is happening in Iran for women in the media? Is there a solution for these violations that women are facing? I think journalists and activists both are in the same situation in Iran.
Yes, they are. And it goes back to actually how much the state allows them the parameters of operation, and also how much the state and the central government would like information to be, disseminated. And we were talking before the program started with Nasta. One of the ways that they try to actually promote their own power is through wrong statistics, and they want to keep information away from people. Like if we go back to November 2019, where Amnesty International has termed it as the bloody massacre in Iran, where internet was shut down for the longest time, and while the internet was shut down, they arrested over 1,500 people, and many of them are journalists. Also, the whole question of during COVID, the journalists who have been researching COVID or environmental issues have been put in jail. Only yesterday, actually, there was the anniversary of a whole plane of journalists, that a plane came down in 2000 and around 2009, 2008, 2009. So, of course, I think what will help and has always helped is solidarity, as Nasta was saying, also sending out more information and to get to allow journalists to connect and send out the details. So what is happening in Iran is, on the one side, on the one hand, it has to do with the legal parameters and the state parameters, but at the same time, it has to do with this culture of chauvinism, and also a state that has also taken, is very good at cyber warfare. They have definitely, their cyber army has been, expanding in the past, since it was started only a few years ago. So by the cyber army, it is an organized way of using digital media to, even attack women journalists who are outside of Iran. And usually because of this society, the cultural parameters, we are faced with the cultural parameters. They attack journalists, specifically women, in a very sexual manner. And the studies that have been done as far as these types of violence, digital violence, the after effect is as bad and as traumatic as when you are in the real situation. So whereas Nasta is being faced with naked power inside, virtually now because of internet, the Islamic Republic and Iran, they have the monopoly not only of access to information, also the cyber army to be able to go after journalists who have left. Many of our journalists who work with us left Iran after 2009, even up to 2 years ago. And they're the ones, the stories that they cover are also social issues. It is not only political issues. Things to do with COVID, for example, has become a very sensitive topic. I could understand if you could say, yes, she was, perhaps one journalist was following the nuclear question, the nuclear story, and she was jailed because of national security. Whereas these journalists are imprisoned, are arrested and imprisoned because they're covering stories that the government, that the regime perceives as to be national security. For example, women's rights, children's rights, environmental rights. And that is, the international community has to do more. I think in my case, I remember when I first came face to face with unfortunately, the Islamic Republic. It was the solidarity of my fellow journalists at the Foreign Press Association, from Le Monde, Newsweek, The Times, Echo of France, that they stuck behind me, in the sense that when I was first elected, there was a call from the embassy to the Foreign Press Association saying, no, do not, she's not Iranian. And then certainly when the embassy wanted to invite all the committee members, they said everybody except Nazenin. And they stood by me. And I think this solidarity and what you are doing as far as bringing us all together and having these voices more and more heard, it's very helpful. And I remember when my first boss at the UN, she told me, I open a door for you, but you keep that door open. And this solidarity of women, of sticking together, and the mentors that are outside in the West, because what we do is very important. It is, as Shaimaa was saying, and Kirstin, when journalists are at the forefront and they see what is happening within protests, they know how to do research and they know how to really fact check in this area where at these times that we are in a very polarized climate. Impartial journalism is more important than anything else. And how do we navigate these waters so that we do not fall prey to disinformation or fake news, but really report it as is? And that's why the first thing that the governments who are not based on, their legal parameters are not based on, first of all, like in Iran, it's theocratic, and the domination of power is not very horizontal, it's very vertical. The powers to be use the state machinery, whether inside the country or its resources outside the country, to silence dissent. And it is thanks to, for example, Iranian journalists like Masih Alinejad, who you have spoken about, her boldness, her courage to bring out the stories of, for example, women journalists inside Iran who had fallen prey to sexual discrimination by their editors. That for them to have to continue to work, they had to really not, be at the mercy of the men. And the society, because it's theocracy and the system is very chauvinistic, at the end of the day, it is their voices that get silenced. And I think one thing that women's rights, when we say women's rights is human rights, is that the story of women crosses across boundaries and divisions of different sectors. It transcends identities. So in an age where political identity is creating more confusion and chaos, I think it is good for us to take into consideration that women's rights is human rights, and equal rights and giving equal opportunity. These are the parameters that I think any political system, whether it is in the United States, whether it is in Iran, Pakistan, elsewhere, matter. Because at the end of the day, if we are going to have a modern world, women are at the forefront of that struggle, because they have come from that tradition of their grandmothers, when, for example, in my case, were educated through a mosque educational system, to where it was secularized, and women got their agency. They were told that they have the agency. But having said that, that is one of also the ironies of Iran, that although the penal code and the state suddenly gave women only half of their rights, women went into education. And at one point, over 60% of students at universities were women, and they became journalists. But that's why then later on, after 2009, Mr. Khamenei wanted to have a new society where, more male change these aspirations and expectations in order for the society to change, and not ask for that change. And that is very important for women to have their voices and for you to give voices to women everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Nazenin. I'll just quickly mention that I think that in your last point, I think that where you see new changes or opportunities for women in a country, you see that more women take up that opportunity with much excitement, and you see more women coming. We see that happening in Afghanistan as well. Where there are more women journalists in the industry now. There are several news channels that only have women staff in Afghanistan. And even though, in our psychology, we talk about gender and women and backwardness of gender in Afghanistan, in terms of documenting violations against women journalists, we don't come across anything in Afghanistan unless a few times it has been the Taliban a few years ago. But we see that there is where in countries where you see an effort to make progress and gender equality. We see that women are in kinds of
yes,
forums,
it is from top down, but it is very important that for the top to create the atmosphere, the culture, where the roots and the streets, it is bottoms up as well. So that the two forces from top down and bottoms up create that force for positive change.
Totally. Completely agree. Kirstin, I wanted to sort of come to you, and I know that we're running out of time. Sorry about that, everyone. I did want to ask, talking about gender a little bit. So in your work in U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, while you're documenting all the attacks, do you see any trend that specifically, that violations against women journalists are specific in any manner in your work? Do you see that? And then I had another question about Donald Trump as well.
Sure. No, so we don't track by demographic information, but the trends overall, but we do have a tag, for example, for sexual harassment. And on that tag that's been used 2019 forward, it's for broadcast. So far, it has not been applied to an assault of a male. It's only been applied to assaults of women, and they've all been broadcasters. Those people who are at the forefront and who's, we've talked about this here, who's, when they are assaulted, it makes the news. So it's talking about that, you had even said it gets the most reaction. So we do have that tag. As far as trends, we see assaults across the entire United States. And what's most interesting is that the majority of them are coming from law enforcement rather than protesters, which is something that we organize by, that you can filter by on the site.
Yeah, and I think earlier you were mentioning, I think that if I noticed correctly, a lot of the international reporter who have also faced challenges of reporting on the front line, or have been in a situation of violation or impediment in the US while covering the protests, were women. I do remember there were 2 Canadian reporters, and you mentioned Australian reporters as well.
Right. So their international news did cover the Black Lives Matter protests. Certainly, there are some still, but certainly in the middle of the summer, June, July, and when protests were really all across the US. And those journalists were equally assaulted, which is a terrible way of saying that they were caught up in the same amount and the same assaults as a local journalist, as a national US journalist. And what was really interesting about that is how it made the news. In Australia, for example, Australia's Channel 7 journalist and photographer were assaulted in DC June 2nd, I believe, early June, and Australia, their news station called and really wanted to talk to the tracker and be like, what is going on here that our journalists are being hurt? It's that how it wasn't expected from the US, right? Everybody's mentioned that here. And that when it did happen, it made international, but that I believe Amelia Brace was her name, and her journalist, the photojournalist, they spoke at a congressional hearing about being assaulted while protest. So it definitely was as much international news as national news because of the amount of international journalists that we have here in the US.
So I think around, I don't remember exactly which quarter this was, but one of the quarters this year, we were documenting attacks against journalists, and of course the US is one of them. And we saw this increase of verbal attacks and impediments that women journalists were facing in Washington, especially when they were going and covering the US press hearings that takes place every day, and specifically Donald Trump addressing women journalists rudely, or those kind of things. And I think that one of the news organizations, Al Jazeera or Guardian, did a story on that as well, called Donald Trump's War Against Women Reporters. We documented in one quarter 51 times of verbal harassments against women journalists coming from the White House. So I think that there has been a clear trend under the Trump administration, at least recently, that there has been verbal violations against women journalists. I wonder that now that we have a new presidency, I wonder if you, documenting all of these attacks and understanding how this new shift is going to take place, what are your hopes with, are you hopeful that things will decline, or do you think that you'll be working just as much as you were working during the previous administration?
Yeah, so a few things there. One of the things that the Press Freedom Tracker does is document in a database President Donald Trump's negative tweets against the media. You can imagine it's been our reporter's full-time job since, it's one of her many hats that she wears, since we have documented from 2015 all the way through today, the negative rhetoric. That's everything from fake press, enemy of the people, fake news, and you can actually search this on the site if you want to search by how many times he said fake news. And this is tweeted and posted. And of course, it's important because Twitter has been used to make policy from this president. So we considered it a newsworthy project to track each and every one of these tweets. As of now, we are past 2,400 negative tweets about the press from the time he declared his candidacy through today.
2,400.
Yeah, beyond that. And we last published on that database, our reporter Stephanie Sugars did that on, it was 2,300 on October 3rd. It was 1 month out from the election. And we figured important 1 month out before the US election, say this is where we are on the negative tweet database, as we call it. So in that time, there's been more than 100 more. That number's probably still ticking up on a daily basis. It is. And so we're able, when we say, oh, we think that Twitter has been used for this, we're actually able to put a number to that. That it's not a we think, it's a that we know, and we know how many times he's gone after each journalist, the top 5 journalists that he goes after. Specifically, we know the outlets that he goes after, but we also know just the rhetoric, fake press, enemy of the people, and can tell you when each of those things came into use. Now, is Stephanie, our reporter, looking forward to putting it into that database? You bet. And will there be another database like that for the Biden-Harris presidency and administration? We will continue to document whatever comes ahead in the days ahead. USFI was hopeful. I'll be honest, I've always said the day that there are not enough press freedom violations that I'm out of a job is actually a really great day. So I'm always hopeful that we don't need to not only have a robust documentation, I think it should always exist, because we've talked about how important documentation is, how important that disinfecting light is, that sunshine. But will it need to be the robust newsroom that it is now? The hope is that not to the same degree. But either way, we'll be here.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I do want to also just quickly ask about your reporter, Stephanie. How is her experience documenting, constantly tracking down everything Donald Trump is saying? Revolves so much around misinformation. What is her experience doing this work?
Yeah, it's a great question because, we sit here all day long and look at journalists, your peers, who are being hurt in the field, who are being assaulted, who are being arrested. In 2019, we documented 9 arrests of journalists in the US. We just surpassed documenting 110 so far this year. And there will be more. We are working through the documentation. So, we do talk about mental health a lot, and we talk about making sure that we communicate and take breaks. And we know that we're on one side of it and have such admiration for those who are on the front lines, for those whom we are documenting. And speaking of arrests, there's a journalist who's arrested on back-to-back nights. There are several who've been arrested more than once. So there are journalists who get assaulted, hit with a projectile, back out the next night, hit with a projectile. And you see this, right? And you see your peers and your colleagues, and it does take a toll. But we are very aware of how important what we're doing is, so that way those journalists in the field can keep doing what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I do want to, just from your point, I did want to acknowledge all the work that our team also does. It does affect mentally, constantly documenting imprisonments, harassments, and things like projectile, which is something that we saw in the Middle East or Africa, North Africa, happening in other parts of the world where we did not imagine would ever happen in the United States. It's kind of almost it's impossible to believe that this kind of stuff could happen in the US. So it's been very difficult year, especially 2020 on that front. And we're very glad that we have a new administration. And there's going to be a lot of time that would be spent seeing if what happens with the new administration. But we hope that things will get better. Which brings me to Shaimaa, if you could just give like a landscape view of if you think that, say, the Biden administration in the US is reasonably better and does not call media the enemy, and does not get as involved in misinformation campaigns against journalists and the press, do you think that things will affect positively in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt? If you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think we feel positive about the new administration actually in the United States, and we believe this will have a good reflection in Egypt and in the Middle East. But it will not be a dramatic or something very big will happen, and I believe this will take some time. What we believe on, and we know that that Biden and his vice and a group of his team who will work on the Middle East policies, they are pro-human rights and pro-democracy in those countries, and he was already well introduced to what's happening in the region. And my organization where I work and the other human rights organization in Egypt and in the region already reached out to those expertise and the people with in the new administration to give them idea about what's happening in the region and how much effort they can do and what we are looking for from them to give us some support. We don't expect something, of course, I don't expect something will be dramatically change very soon, but it will take some time, but at least maybe with a year time, we could see kind of effect of the new administration on the region in terms of democracy and press freedom.
At least it won't be that blatant. I do want to say it has a lot to do with that power that international support has had on human rights in a lot of countries around the world. That has had to do a little bit with maybe a lot, with US being seen as a powerful country, and that United States having the influence on other countries, right? So once that influence is, if that influence remains or, you know, reinvigorates depending on the policies of the new administration, maybe we will see some changes. And maybe I think we could also see, you know, dictatorial policies thriving. I think that we are seeing some of that right now. I think we are seeing in the last 2 weeks, by the way, we have documented a huge number of attacks. Until last month, our average was 1.27 attacks per day, and in the last 2.5 weeks, it became 2.07 attacks per day on average, which means that there is an increasing number of attacks. And I think what my assessment is, I think some countries are trying to make sure that, you know, that they're able to stifle the press as much as they can and establish, you know, that the kind of blackout that they want in the media. We are all familiar with Maria Ressa's case in the Philippines, and there are some new number of charges against one of the tweets that she made. So the government has made some new charges against her. So this is basically adding more and more pressure against journalists, when I think that some countries who are, you know, emboldened by Donald Trump feel like they will have to, you know, compromise a little bit. I think they're trying to be more aggressive, and we're seeing that trend in the last 2.5 weeks. So I hope that things do get better. To conclude, I wanted to just wrap up and say, I think that when it comes to, we're talking about violations and press freedom challenges, and this conversation has so much tension and pessimism. But I think that one thing to remember is I've been a journalist myself. Kirstin has been a journalist as well. And all of you who are doing your work in the field, I think one thing to remember is that journalists are still, we are imprisoned, and there are different kind of challenges we face, but I think journalists consistently work. One thing that really helps women reporters in particular, especially in countries where there's a lot of gender disparity, is to have support systems. And I think support systems, we have seen that trend, that where there are more better, stronger support systems, women are able to stick around, be able to do their work, find resources of support, and continue to do the reporting that they want to do, even if there are simultaneous challenges going on in the field. So thank you, everyone, for joining this conversation, and thank you for doing your work. And we hope that 2021 begins with better press freedom and access for women in the field.
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.